Samuel Kane had lived 40 long years under the Texas sun, a man of strength, honesty, and hard labor. Yet loneliness hung around his shoulders heavier than any saddle he had ever carried, because despite the broad expanse of his ranch, despite the respect the townsfolk gave him as a hard-working rancher, Samuel carried a secret that gnawed at him. He had never known the touch of a woman, never shared his bed, never even been kissed in earnest. And it wasn't because he didn't want to, but because life had a way of slipping by faster than cattle through a broken gate. His mother had passed when he was still young, his father soon after, leaving Samuel the ranch and a debt of responsibility that tied him to the land like an unbreakable rope. So while other men courted in town, danced in the saloon, and found wives to fill their homes with laughter, Samuel stayed behind fixing fences, taming wild horses, and keeping wolves off his herd. Until one day he realized he was 40, strong as an ox yet untouched, untested in the arms of love. And though some men teased him quietly, and some women looked past him as though his quiet nature made him invisible, Samuel resigned himself to the thought that maybe it just wasn't meant for him. But fate, unpredictable and wild as a prairie storm, had other plans because on a hot summer afternoon, as dust rolled in from the road, a stagecoach cracked to a halt near his ranch, and from it stumbled a young woman in a torn city dress, her eyes wide with panic, her lips dry from the heat, and before Samuel could ask her name, she fell into his arms whispering, "Please, sir, just let me stay the night." And in that moment, the rancher's world began to change forever. Samuel lifted the fainting woman into his cabin, the worn wooden door creaking as he pushed it open with his shoulder, and laid her gently on his bed. The first time in his life a woman had ever touched those sheets, his heart pounding harder than a galloping stallion, as he looked at her delicate frame, sprawled against the rough quilt, her dress dirtied from travel, her shoes scuffed from the road, and though she was a stranger, he felt a strange pull inside him, something protective, something tender, something he had long buried beneath the duties of ranch life. When she woke, her eyes fluttered open like a frightened bird, hazel and filled with both fear and stubborn strength. And she tried to rise, but Samuel held out his hand gently, saying, "Don't strain yourself, miss. You're safe here." His deep voice steady, though his chest shook with nerves, for he had never been this close to a woman, never had one look at him with such raw vulnerability. And she pressed her lips together before whispering, "My name's Clara. I came west chasing a promise of love, but he left me at the depot with nothing." And Samuel felt a fire of anger rise at the faceless man who had abandoned her in this harsh land where a woman alone was as good as doomed. Clara's eyes brimmed with tears she tried to hide, saying softly, "They laughed at me, called me foolish, said I wasn't fit for ranch life. I didn't know where else to go. So I begged the driver to stop when I saw your ranch." And Samuel, unused to speaking his heart, only nodded, his rough hand curling into a fist because he wanted to protect her from the cruelty she'd endured. And when she asked in a trembling voice, "Please, sir, just let me stay the night, only one night. I'll be gone in the morning," Samuel felt words rise unbidden, words he had never imagined himself saying. "Miss Clara, you don't need to beg, not here. You can stay as long as you need. I don't turn folks away." And in that instant her gaze softened, the fear in her eyes melting into relief, though Samuel's chest grew tighter, because he knew deep inside that her presence would stir parts of his soul he had long kept buried, parts that might burn brighter than the Texas sun if he wasn't careful. But as the night settled and the prairie wind howled outside, Samuel realized for the first time in 40 years he wasn't truly alone. That night stretched longer than any Samuel had ever known. The silence of the prairie broken only by the distant howl of coyotes and the crackle of the fire as he sat in his chair pretending to read an old Bible. Though his eyes never left the shadow of Clara lying in his bed, her breathing soft and even, her curls spilling across the pillow in a way that made his chest ache. Because here was a woman from another world, a city girl too fine for a rugged place like his cabin. Yet she was there under his roof, and every fiber of his being warred with itself. Part of him wanted to flee outside and sleep in the barn just to keep temptation at bay, while another part longed to stay close, to guard her through the night, to drink in the fragile miracle of not being alone. But as the fire burned low, Clara stirred, her eyes catching his in the dim glow, and in that moment the walls Samuel had built over 40 years began to crack. Because she whispered, "You're kind. Kinder than any man I've met out here," and her voice carried a tremor that pierced his heart. For he had always believed himself plain, unworthy of admiration, just a man with calloused hands and a simple ranch. And yet she looked at him as if he were her only safe harbor. She rose slowly, the quilt falling from her shoulders, and walked toward him barefoot, her steps soft on the wooden floor. And though Samuel's pulse thundered, he remained still, afraid that moving would shatter the fragile thread between them, until she stood before him, her eyes glistening as she whispered, "I begged you to let me stay the night, but truth is, I wanted more than shelter. I wanted someone who saw me, someone who wouldn't leave." And Samuel's breath caught because no woman had ever spoken such words to him. No woman had ever asked for his heart. And as she reached for his rough hand, pressing it to her cheek, he felt the heat of her skin, the softness against his calluses, and something inside him surrendered, not to desire alone, but to the aching need for love he had buried his whole life. Yet even as she leaned closer, her lips trembling near his, Samuel gently cupped her face and whispered, "Clara, I don't know how to do this. I've never been with a woman before." The confession tasting like fire and freedom, and instead of mocking him, instead of recoiling, she smiled through tears, whispering back, "Then we'll learn together." And in that tender vow, the lonely rancher felt a new dawn rise inside him, one brighter than any sun over the wide Texas plains. Morning broke with golden light spilling across the plains, painting the cabin in warmth as Samuel stirred from the chair where he had finally dozed, though not before Clara had nestled close against him, her head resting on his chest as though it had always belonged there. And for the first time in 40 years, Samuel awoke not to silence but to the soft sound of a woman's breathing, the simple miracle of another heart beating near his own. And he knew then that the loneliness that had carved him hollow all those years had begun to heal. Clara blinked awake, her hair tangled but her eyes shining. And when she saw his arm still protectively around her, she gave a small laugh, a sound that startled Samuel because it was so light, so free, like a bird song on a quiet morning. And she whispered, "I was so afraid you'd tell me to leave." To which Samuel, fumbling but earnest, replied, "Clara, you don't understand. I've lived my whole life waiting without knowing what I was waiting for. Until last night, when you walked through my door," his voice breaking with the weight of truth, and her hand slid into his, steady and warm as she whispered back, "Then let me stay, not just for a night, but for as long as you'll have me." Words that shook Samuel to his core, because never had he imagined someone would want him, not for his land, not for his cattle, but for himself, a quiet rancher with no experience of love. And in that moment he vowed silently that he would spend the rest of his days proving himself worthy of the gift she offered. The town would talk, Samuel knew. Tongues would wag about the city girl who found her way to a lonely rancher's cabin, about how quickly she stayed, but none of that mattered. Because as he saddled his horse that afternoon with Clara beside him, her skirts brushing against the dust, and she laughed at her clumsy attempts to mount, Samuel realized she was not a burden nor a passing guest, but a partner, someone who might breathe life into the quiet ranch, someone who might teach him that love was not about knowing how, but about daring to begin. And as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with fire, Samuel wrapped his arm around Clara's waist and whispered against her hair, "I may have been a virgin to love all these years, but I'll spend the rest of my life making up for it." And she pressed her lips to his cheek, whispering, "That's all I've ever wanted." And in that quiet vow, the lonely rancher found the courage he never thought he'd possess. Courage not of cattle or storms, but of the heart. And from that day on, Samuel Kane was lonely no more. And that, friends, is how a 40-year-old rancher, who had never known love, finally found it when fate sent a city girl to his door. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful Wild West stories of love, courage, and redemption. Hit that bell icon so you never miss the next tale. We've got more unforgettable journeys coming your way.